Okay, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is our Med Mentor segments on interviews, and actually it's sort of part one of a couple that we're planning to have. This one is going to specifically cover some of the more one-on-one type interactions you might have with faculty members, and then we'll be moving on to some other types in the following week with MMIs or other types where you might be like in the same room with a couple of other applicants. So today, I think I put the agenda in the chat, but I think we'll put it again just for anyone joining afterwards. We're hoping to cover a couple of different things, and at the end, give you sort of a sneak peek of what the actual interview experience might look like. So everyone that you have seen here is already sort of been through this process, so they are veterans of it, and they have all the best advice that they can possibly give. So with that, I think we'll maybe go into some brief introductions. Maybe we'll go by alphabetical order by first name. How about that?
Suppose that's me first. Hi everyone, my name's Amelia. I am an incoming MS1 to DGSOM. I'm super excited to get started. Was there any other information I was supposed to give? I know you just said this.
If you want to have a fun fact or something, whatever you want.
Fun fact. I played my first game of pool ever yesterday, and I was really bad at it, but I'm excited to get better.
Hi, I'm Christina. I'm a current MS3, and I'll be your Q&A chat responder. So any questions you guys have, just throw it in. I'll answer it for you guys.
I'm Michaela. I'm an incoming MS2. Fun fact about me is that I spent my whole life before moving to LA in South Dakota. So born and raised on a farm.
Hi everyone, I'm Megan. I am also an MS3 like Christina, and I guess a fun fact is that I used to be really into heavy metal, and I'm kind of getting back into it in the last couple of months. So if you have any recommendations, hit me up.
Hi, I'm Win, rising MS2 like Michaela, and fun fact is, I've been at UCLA since 2013, so it's been a while. Probably be here for a while too, but that's okay.
All right, thank you for introducing yourselves. I'm Ryan. You might know me from some of the past sessions, and some of the other people on this panel have also done some past ones. I am a PhD 1 right now in MSTP, and really enjoy doing this type of stuff. Fun fact for me, I have a twin who goes here for a master's program. So if you see someone who looks remotely like me, who's popping in and out of Terasaki building, it's probably him. But anyway, without further ado, all right, so we'll just sort of dive right into things. The first section that we have is going to be in interview preparations. So I'm sure all of you have heard things like from med students or like surfing SDN or Reddit or whatnot, and you've heard like, oh, what should you're frantically looking up, what are the things that I should do for interviews, how to prepare for questions and whatnot. So I think we'll lead with that topic right now, and we'll just sort of open it up to the panel. Maybe you could describe a little bit of your experience. Did you have like a plan moving into your interviews, or did you sort of wing it? Like, what was your strategy moving forward?
I can go first. So for me, interviews were barely a couple months ago, so I understand the stress. I think I had a unique experience compared to everybody else on this panel, given that all of my interviews were virtual. I'm not sure how many interviews will be virtual this year. So I've got plenty of tips for like how to navigate virtual interviews. I don't know how to navigate in-person interviews, so everybody else can chime in on that. I think the preparation, though, is pretty much the same. You want to make sure that you know a good deal about the school that you're going to, and you want to have a good grasp on why that school. Something that I've heard a lot of people say, and I'm sure you've heard it too, is like once you're at the interview phase, the school likes you. So, it's like you're going on a date and you already know that the person you're going on a date with is into you, right? Like, so you want to go into it feeling confident, but also have a good idea for why you'd be a good fit for the school and why the school would be a good fit for you. And I think that's a good motto for how you should approach all the interviews. Like every conversation you have should be incorporating why you're a good fit for them and why they're a good fit for you. And if you can do that pretty solidly, that'll be a solid interview.
I can go next. In addition to all that, I would say make sure you do your research as to what type of interviews the school will do. Some schools do both traditional interviews, group interviews, MMIs, or a combination of all three. And so knowing what type of interview you're going into can help you practice that format. And if there's any piece of advice that I would give, it would be just to practice in front of a mirror, practice recording yourself, seek out a mentor or friend or someone and have them either look up interview questions or bring them a list and let them decide. But if I could give one piece of advice, it would just be to practice, because talking about ourselves can be one of the hardest things, and making it concise is really important for interview day.
One thing that I will add that I thought was really helpful was just refamiliarizing myself with my application before each interview, because we put so much effort into that application and building that story, and it can feel like, oh, this interview is this like whole new thing, but it really is just an extension of that process, and they want to get to know that person better. So just kind of go back, think about what you emphasized, what aspects of yourself you most were tied to and what you thought the school liked best, and kind of maybe build some of your thoughts around that idea. I mean, with the research that you do on the school, kind of see where you fit in. And I think that really helps with continuing to build on what you've already done. So you're really not starting afresh. Like this isn't a first impression, this is your second or third impression that they're seeing of you.
And to go off what I want to say as well, I think for me, I always advocate like you should have a script at least. Most people think like you shouldn't feel like you're reading from something, but I think a lot of people underestimate is when they go into a situation they're not familiar with, they're very nervous and they just forget everything that they're supposed to say. So if you have a script down, I mean, just go through a routine, so then when you go into an interview room, and then like the nerve will just kind of take away some of that preparedness. And I think you're a lot more prepared. So then, so just prepare a script. I would say 2 to 3 minutes long for two main questions is tell me about yourself. And then I would say the other second one is summarize for one of your big projects. For most of us, going to be a research and a community project that you're very passionate about. I think like those two is going to be the big ones you have to prepare for. And why medicine, I just limit to tell me about yourself.
I think one thing I'll add on to sort of the topic of scripts is that, like Lynn said, you really don't want to come across as sort of having a rote memorized script of like saying things word for word like a robot. But the point of having sort of key points that you can remember and sort of fall back on when your brain is just going nuts in that sort of new place is a really helpful way to sort of get started. Especially when they bring you in and maybe you're expecting some sort of like really formal introduction, like, oh, I'm Dr. So-and-so, I'm gastroenterologist, and today we'll be talking about you. They'll just sort of dive right in like, okay, what's your biggest weakness? And then you're just like, okay. So having, as Wynn alluded to, having sort of some really key points for questions that you might anticipate, just sort of to fall back on, is a really good approach to make sure that you don't sort of have some of the moments that I had when it was just like, yeah.
I remember making flashcards and like just putting bullet points down and reviewing those the morning of. So I thought that was really helpful.
And if your interviews happen to be virtual, you have those flashcards right in front of you.
So follow-up question, I think the mention of practice was pretty emphasized. And so I'm curious as to what, like who did you go to in terms of seeking out people to practice with? Was it parents, was it friends, was it like physicians or residents that you knew, medical students? Who did you reach out to?
I reached out to a pre-medical advisor for like one mock interview, and I think that was really great to hear somebody who probably knows people on admissions committees and things like that. People who don't sit on admissions committees but are still in medicine don't know what admissions committees are thinking. So I think a lot of times people can fall into a trap of like seeking people in medicine, and they might know what they're talking about, but if they don't have experience on admissions committees, they might not know what admissions committees are thinking. That being said, my real opinion is go to somebody who knows you, because at the end of the day, the interview is just a conversation, and the admissions committees will do what the admissions committees will do. And at the end of the day, you want to represent yourself authentically. So if you're talking to somebody who knows you, they know what you're like, they know what you look like when you're stressed. They can help point out some of the things that might not look so nice when you're talking to somebody professionally. So people who know you can understand if you're really representing yourself as you deserve.
People who know you can also tell you what you should add to your answers, which is absolutely fantastic. Sometimes you forget the greatest things about yourself because, you know, we're not out here trying to hype ourselves up, but our friends are, and they'll remember that like one random thing you did and they'll be like, why don't you talk about that? And it's super helpful because we tend to forget. So I would say I 100% second that.
Yeah, I asked my dad to grill me, and he did so quite well. So I think one thing that you want to do as part of your preparations is sort of anticipate the spectrum of experiences you might encounter. And that could be the nicest interviewer who wants to genuinely know you, who's just like, I don't know, it just seems like the type of person you would vibe with for like a good decade. And then you could have the other type of person where you're just like, as soon as you walk into that door, you just want to get out. And being able to sort of have experiences on all ends of, or both ends of that spectrum and in between will give you sort of some experience, so you don't have to have that for the first time. So what I did was I would ask my dad, okay, let's do a really nice interview first, where you like are really sweet and you want to get to know me and all of that, and you ask like nice questions, and then let's do a 180 flip right in the middle, and you turn into like the worst possible interviewer you could ever think of. And my dad is a physician, so he is entirely like able to sort of observe what people are like in that sort of scenario and flip that switch. And so it was a really good, I think, practice for me to sort of be this like lulled sense of some comfort, and then all of a sudden be thrust into the deep end, asking all the hard questions and sort of interrupting me and sort of saying that he didn't agree with me and that maybe I shouldn't be applying and all that kind of stuff. So getting sort of those ends of the spectrum, I think, is also a really good thing to do. Okay.
I would add on to that, Ryan, and say find someone too who can interview you with no emotion, because I remember having an interviewer who was straight faced the whole time, and you know, you think like, do they like my answers, do they not, am I saying the right things or the wrong things? And so it could be that they, you know, like your answers, are okay with them, and but it's just they interview everyone the same and it's just kind of a blank face. So that was one type of interview or interviewer that I didn't really prep for and kind of wish I would have known was coming. But definitely ask your friends, family, really anyone. And I would second that if you don't have someone available, just, you know, do it in a mirror and record yourself even.
And that's super great advice for those virtual interviews where it's asynchronous and you just have to record yourself talking. Those are way harder than in-person interviews because there's nobody giving you feedback. But like, you know, like Michaela said, some in-person interviews are similar in that that person also gives you no feedback. But if you can get through like talking to yourself and like practice that over and over, it'll be the same thing. You'll have your like self view on, if that's helpful. So that's really good practice for those asynchronous ones.
I guess another follow-up question. So the sort of behavior of the interviewer is brought up, and I think this is a very significant point, especially when it's a one-on-one. So if you are willing to go into details, perhaps could you share a little bit about sort of the type of person you are? So for example, I'm usually a more reserved person. I don't express a lot. I don't emote a lot. So sometimes that's challenging. And how did that play a role in how you presented yourself and carried yourself in the interview, depending on what the other person was doing? I guess I'll lead with a little example. So like I said, I'm not particularly expressive or emoting, although maybe some of the mentor videos suggest otherwise. But like I distinctly remember I had one interviewer who I was kind of iffy about, like just doing some background research and like maybe this isn't the best person that should be interviewing me, like we don't have aligned interests or whatever. And so I went in, and so I was feeling very nervous, very sort of sort of clammed up a little bit, shelled off to the whole world. And this guy just sort of started talking about nothing related to medicine, nothing related to research. And all of a sudden, it was like the floodgates of social butterfly Ryan just unleashed. And we had this amazing conversation that didn't talk about anything related to academics. And so I think for me, I found that mirroring the behavior and the expressivity of the person I was talking to was something that fueled my responses. So if that person started to sort of become more serious, then I found myself becoming more serious. But if that person opened up and was very bubbly, then I started to open up and become more bubbly. But I'm really curious as to how other people approach this.
I personally don't think I'm also the person who don't really express emotions a whole lot, like right, I mentioned, but I don't think I try to mimic the energy from the interviewer as much. I mean, like most of my interviewer has been really nice and they have been like very warm, and I don't really have any one-on-ones that are like very cold person. But for the most part, I think like I just try to stay true to who I was and then how I can be fit as a physician. So I just want to be like, I pay attention to that, like what they're talking about. I try to like express body language to say like, hey, I'm paying attention to what you're saying. This is what I'm thinking. So I'm more like a warm kind of presence there. And for the most part, I think like that works for me. So I don't really try to like tune up or down, but that was just my experience for one-on-one.
I am super bubbly and expressive. And so I actually did the same thing. Like I didn't really tune myself to the interviewer. I just was myself, and that was fairly expressive and like emotional. But something that I did do is I would mirror the interviewer's sort of desire for like a two-way conversation. So if an interviewer was interjecting like while I was talking in like a conversation type way, I would I would probably ask them more questions as we go along. I treated it more like a conversation. But if the interviewer was very much like, this is my first question, this is my second question, let's just get through this interview, then I stuck to that format. I answered the first question, I answered the second question. So it depends. I think that is really helpful in showing them that you are able to like listen and have like a communicative discussion on their own terms. And I think that shows a lot of like emotional intelligence as well. So that's probably good. But yeah, I didn't really change like my style of speaking or anything because I can't, even if I wanted to.
I would agree that you have to match the interviewer's style of interviewing. But I'd also second what Ryan was saying in that if someone is just naturally more talkative or is laughing, then, I feel more comfortable laughing or adding different comments that maybe aren't quite as serious or, be okay getting off topic. But I definitely had other interviews that it was like, this is my first question, this is my second question. And I did my best, to stick to those questions and didn't vary or ask too many questions until the end when, they give the time to say, now, do you have any questions for me?
Yes, that's an excellent segue into another question. So I think a very ubiquitous thing that is in the mind of every pre-med, myself including back in the day, was how long should my response be? How do I know when it's too long? How do I know when it's too short? Does it change by the question, or is there some threshold that I should always sort of keep ticking in the back of my mind so I don't go overboard? Thoughts?
I've gotten the advice to time yourself. Like we were talking about scripts earlier, you can have a script for something and time yourself. Personally, I didn't do that. I found that made me a lot more stressed about my answer. I mean, you can have a conversation, like you understand when you are oversharing and you understand when you haven't answered a question. So you want to stay in that range. It really just is a conversation, very stressful one, obviously, but you sort of know the norms of conversation. So I think you'd be able to self-regulate like when something is too long. Timers really stressed me out. I'd be looking at the clock, I'd be looking at the timer. It didn't work for me. So if they work for you, then that could be a potential solution.
So I think ideally it should be 2 to 3 minutes, but if timer stresses you out, don't pay attention to timers. For me, the rule of thumb is, I have done as an interviewer for some of the student groups before, and then what I found really good for an answer is you have to give an example. If you can end with an example and demonstrate that you have that capacity, or if you don't have an experience, then you can just say like, I haven't had this experience before, but this is what I would do. As long as you can have that details in there, it doesn't feel too long or it doesn't feel too short, because I think like that is what they're looking for, is that you can demonstrate that capability.
If you find yourself to kind of dragging on an answer, you think that it's becoming too long, you can sometimes read the interviewer. And if they are losing eye contact or they don't seem as interested, that might be a cue to start wrapping up.
I would also, when preparing some of the more common questions, like the answers, I would have them in bullet points where I was like, I could cover 3 bullet points or 5 bullet points, kind of depending on what the situation was. And like Michaela was saying, like read the room. And if I felt like they wanted a little bit more and they were still intrigued by what I was talking about, I would continue. But if it felt like a more zippy, rapid type of interview, I would just cut myself short. So kind of give myself some options with how I answer questions.
Yeah, I think that's a phenomenal piece of advice. Sort of when I was a kid doing science fairs, we did similar things in prepping for judging rounds, where sometimes you'd have a judge that's like, okay, 30 seconds, go. And then you just start like sitting there trying to encapsulate everything you've done in a year in 30 seconds. And other times you have a judge that's like, okay, tell me everything. And you're like, okay, buckle up. This is going to be an autobiography. So I think Megan's point is very good in the sense that you want to have different lengths for different topics and be able to adapt to what you think is the most appropriate length. We did get an awesome question. I think actually a couple of related questions in our Q&A that I'd like to actually take some time here. I think it fits pretty well in the sort of prepping for interview module. The question sort of in regards to, usually interviewers expect that you have questions for them. And so what types of questions would you recommend? Are there ways to sort of ask questions even if you don't have a specific one in mind for that specific school?
I typically, go ahead, Megan. I typically ask about what brings them to the school in the first place. I usually start with that and then see what they have in mind.
Depending on what position the person is, if they're a dean or anyone in that respect, I would often ask how the school addresses student concerns. For some reason, that was a question that they love to talk about. Our deans love to talk about it too at UCLA. It's just something that they work hard on and they're really proud of, and they want to show you that if you ever had a concern in the future, they'd be able to take care of it. And I've had people speak extensively on all the different systems that are available. It's less, it works better as a question than just asking about like logistics in terms of curriculum and stuff, because only a few deans would be involved with that. But most people in the school administration know something about reporting, et cetera. For some reason that worked for me. I don't know if that would work for everyone.
All right. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I didn't necessarily have standard ones. Mine usually pertains to research things just because of sort of the program I was aiming for. But I think if you have specific interests or opportunities in mind, you could ask like, oh, do you know if there's a group on campus that does this? And if the answer is no, then that could lead into a segue of you saying, oh, if I come here, I could potentially be interested in starting this. So it shows initiative, it shows sort of long-term vision, but also a genuine curiosity. All right. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with both Brian and Megan here in that like everything that you want to say should point to the fit, right? The like how you fit to the school and how the school fits you. So if your questions can get at that, then that's a good question. It's I always think that you should have prepared questions. You don't necessarily know who your interviewer is until like maybe a day before. But I always think that you should have prepared questions that are tailored to who your interviewer is and that also represent the fit. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. We will migrate into our next agenda section here called interview do's and don'ts. So maybe we could I'll sort of lead with a couple of examples I have, but in the meantime, we can think of some things that like you absolutely want to do at every single one-on-one faculty interview, other things you absolutely do not want to do at any one-on-one single faculty interview. So for me, I think one thing that you always want to do is that first initial impression. Usually, I guess pre-COVID, there's usually some sort of like handshake or whatnot, and I think it tends to get swept under the rug in favor of sort of, oh, like your responses have to have all these really good content things in it, and you have to have good stories and good patient experiences. But I think that the power of that first impression really sets a long sort of precedent for everything to come. So if the way that you walk into that room, that you make eye contact with that person, that you greet them and potentially other people in that environment, will really sort of give that interviewer a glimpse into your personality. And hopefully it's the genuine personality in which you would portray it in any sort of scenario. So I think that's a major do. Another do, I think, would be sort of how there's been some discussion about knowing interviewers ahead of time. You totally want to do research on the interviewers that you know you'll be talking to, because you might get some interesting tidbits. Like I remember there was one that I frantically looked this person up the night before, and I found out this person went to the same undergrad as me, and oh, lo and behold, they like were somehow related to my PI. So it was an interesting talking point that it just sort of popped out and fell out. But if I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have known. So it can sort of give you like these nice ins into like different tangential conversations that really open up into nice conversations. A don't, I would say, is saying a lot, and I think that might come across as like a little harsh, but there are so many people that if you listen carefully, that you can hear or like a lot, so many times. And I feel like if you think that might be you, I would encourage you either get someone to listen to you and explicitly look for those things, or you yourself keep track of them. When I was in high school, I think I said like a billion times a minute. And so I actually got to the point where I would just like briefly mark my hand with like my arm with my fingernail, not like hard or anything, just to like mark myself like, oh, wow, that was 5 in like 20 seconds. There was a like right there. So I think that's a major don't. Like be cognizant of very eccentric things that you find in your speech. And I'll shut up now.
I would say like a do is to remember your passion. You might be on your like 4th or 5th interview, and you might be giving the same answers that you've said previously. You've written secondaries about it. It might be like the 100th time you've thought about this, but you still have to bring that energy and that excitement with every single interview, because it starts to show when, you know, you've kind of said this a million times and you've rehearsed it and it just like comes out, versus when you really are thinking about it and talking about an activity that you did at a particular event that really meant something to you. They can tell. So I think just kind of take a step back before every interview and just remind yourself that you did enjoy that activity. It was really important to you, even if you've talked about it many times. And I think a don't, and I don't know if this was just me, is don't get too into a conversation. Sometimes there are interviewers that are very friendly and you're conversing, but just, you know, always remember that it's like a professional space. And I remember as we were having a conversation, I ended up asking my interviewer a question, and I thought it was like, you know, a conversation, but in that context, I look back and I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have asked that question in that context. It was definitely a them asking me questions type interview. So just like keep that in mind as you go forward, because sometimes you can settle into it, and some interviewers are just so friendly and so wonderful, and you just kind of want to just let your flow of thoughts go. So also keep that in mind.
I would say a couple do's are be cautious of your nonverbal cues and your posture. Some interviews may be longer than others, and you know, you can have interviews that are up to an hour, and even at the end of the hour, you want to be as attentive as you were at the beginning. A tip I was given as far as eye contact goes is if you need a brief moment to gather your thoughts, it's better to look up than down, just because down can mean that you're unsure of yourself or you're not confident. And so it was a safer bet, I guess, to look up. I'm not sure if that's good or bad, but that was one piece of advice that I still hold when I'm, you know, interviewing, is that, you know, I'll look up in a way if I need to take a moment. And related to that, it's okay to take pauses and take breaks. Don't jump into an answer if you're unsure of, you know, the direction you want to take it or what you may want to talk about. And you can say, I need a moment to gather my thoughts. That's completely okay. And it's a lot safer than jumping into something and trying to backtrack when you decide that it wasn't the correct answer. Also at the end, sorry, make sure that you thank them for their time. So just as Ryan was saying at the beginning of the first impression, you also want to leave a great last impression.
I've got a bunch of like virtual interviews do and don'ts. So in case you have virtual interviews this cycle, which I bet you will. I think that camera angles are super important. You know, some computers just have that camera from like way down below and it just doesn't make you look very flattering. And I would invest in something like a camera attachment or something so that you can really look your best. I always elevated my laptop so that my camera at the top like looked at me really nicely. I got a light to put like just my regular floor lamp from my apartment, but I put it behind my computer to illuminate my face. So I really did look good. I do think that these nonverbal things in a virtual interview become important because there are no other ways to really establish your first impression, and you don't want to make a bad impression or look lazy or look unfocused. So if you can, you know, keep the energy up and look nice on camera, then I think you'll be good at not making a bad impression. Something else, I saw that some universities, some medical schools liked the use of virtual backgrounds. So I tended to use a virtual background on all of my virtual interviews. It just looked more professional. It normalized virtual backgrounds for people who may not have had a space that like looked super professional. So it made it look really uniform, and overall I think showed like a level of empathy that I think people appreciated. Something that worked for me, contradicts something that I said earlier, but I hid my self view on Zoom. I have a bad habit of always looking at myself if I'm it's just a habit and it's not a good one. So I hid my self view on all of my interviews so that I didn't get distracted by the way I looked or anything like that. And I was able to more authentically engage with the interviewer. And then I also adjusted my Zoom screen to be able to look directly into my camera so that I could give the illusion of eye contact. A lot of people say that that's not really a necessary step, just because we're all used to Zoom now. So even if we're not looking directly into the camera, if we're looking slightly away, people understand. But I think that whatever you can do to sort of increase your the appearance of your engagement, I think is always going to be a win for you. So I looked into the camera as best as I could for all of them. Also, on the topic of like first impressions, since you don't really have a handshake or anything like that, I made sure to dress in a way that looked professional but still kind of stood out, either like a pop of color or you know, maybe a scarf or something, I don't know, something that is professional but that does make you stand out so that they can remember, oh, that's the girl with the pink blouse, or that's the person with, I know people who brought like interesting coffee mugs to drink out of while they were on screen, like I don't know, but you can take that with a grain of salt, but it is another way to help you stand out. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now.
Yes, well, we had that stint on virtual interviews. So we did have a mid-mentor Monday last year that went into a couple of those tips. So I'm going to share an embarrassing slide. And I think Megan knows what I'm talking about. But here it is. So hopefully that is displaying correctly. And I think what we were trying to go for here is that with a virtual interview, there are so many things that are like elements of the aesthetic that we don't normally think about if we're in an in-person interview, because you're in a room, you're talking to someone, and it's just sort of natural that you are going to a place that is not your own. But of course, with the virtual interview, you are in sort of your comfort space. And clearly me on the left is very much in his comfort space. So I think it's really just to be important to think of some differences. So not to go through every single animation, but essentially these are just some things you might want to keep in mind. I think Amelia mentioned a lot of them. So, you know, just sort of be cognizant, you know, the quality of your photo, the background colors. Obviously some COVID hair was happening here and I still have some going on now. And other aspects as well to consider. But I just wanted to drop that really quickly in case you have virtual interviews. Feel free to reach out if you have additional questions there. But we'll stop sharing there and then go on any other do's or don'ts before we go into some mock interviews.
Just have one. Oh, sorry. I just have one quick do: get good sleep the night before. That's my only do for you. It's no matter what else you do, if you don't have a good energy, that's not good.
I just wanted to jump in on the virtual background question that I saw in the Q&A. Sometimes the university or medical school offers their own virtual backgrounds. And so you can have like their virtual background, but if not, anything that's neutral and not distracting is a good idea, even like the blur that I've got going on.
All right, it is that time. So what we're going to do now is move into a couple of sort of mock interview questions. So I'm going to be posing as an interviewer, and then our awesome set of panelists here are going to go in sort of like a round robin and what might be some common interview questions, and maybe I'll throw in some weird ones too. We'll see. But any takers for the first question, or should I just go super random with this power? All right, well, Megan, nice to meet you. My name is Dr. Shi. I'm one of the radiation oncologists here at UCLA. I've been asked to interview you today. So, I haven't seen your application. I know nothing about you. Tell me about yourself.
Well, nice to meet you, Dr. Sheet. As you know, my name is Megan. I am from the Bay Area, lifelong resident. Was born in the South Bay and went to UC Berkeley. Go Bears. At Berkeley, I studied molecular and cell biology, did a minor in nutritional science. I was thinking that I was going to pursue immunology all the way through until a PhD, but during that process, 4 years is a long time, and I kind of discovered my passion for, volunteering, especially in relation to like sexual health testing, became an HIV test counselor, and realized that that people aspect was really important to me. And so that was something that I wanted to pursue further. Right now, I'm actually in my second gap year. I'm currently working as a clinical research coordinator at Stanford in cancer immunotherapies, and I get to interact with patients a lot, get them through their day-to-day patient interactions, their visits. There's a lot that goes into these clinical trials, as you probably know, and it's been a really fulfilling job. And now I'm here on the interview trail, hoping to pursue medicine in the future, continue to do that. I'm kind of interested in working with older adults, but just generally in having time with patients to care for them and provide them with the help that they need. Just, I guess, a fun fact about me and some things that I enjoy. I'm an avid movie watcher, and I love to spend my time, going to the movies. Kind of been taking some film classes on the side. So if you have any recommendations for me, I'd absolutely love to hear them.
Awesome, thank you. Actually, so what we'll do, I think, instead of doing like a round robin, we'll take a brief break in between each interview and then take that opportunity to sort of discuss how the interview went. So I'll give my thoughts. I think Megan did a phenomenal job. There was a wealth of information that I got. I got a geographic background, I got undergrad background, I got interest background, I got hobby background. There were so many things within that answer that if it was a free-form interview, I literally have like the oyster as my, get the phrase, the world is my oyster, whatever it is. Essentially, I could pick with whatever I wanted to go on. And if I had a more structured interview plan, then I could also go that route as well. So she paid very much attention to how I was engaging, and I seemed to be engaging a lot. So she sort of kept going on. But I imagine if I sort of had looked off to the side or looked at my non-existent watch, then perhaps that would have been cut short a little bit as well. So awesome job. Any thoughts regarding Megan's phenomenal performance from the other panelists?
I think she ended on a really nice note to show that she's like fun and she has a personality outside of medicine. And she ended on a note that makes the interviewer, like she asked the interview for recommendations. Like that's a really engaging and inviting way to end. Not that you have to end every answer that way, but like on a tell me about yourself question, like that was a really, really great ending. And also the interviewer said that he hadn't read her application. So to be able to give a great summary of her resume was really strong so that he can pick where he wants to go next. Other people may have read your resume, and that may have changed the structure of her answer. It may not, but that's something to keep in mind too.
Any other thoughts?
Something that I will add, because I was trying to fish that out of my memory from 2018, which is when I interviewed pre-COVID. A lot of stuff was different back then. But I think I was kind of struggling to remember why certain decisions were made and why those were important to me. And I think, had this been a real interview, that would be something that I would have thought about right before the interview of what were those turning points in my life and why did I make those decisions? Because I think I could have definitely given you a little bit better perspective into my thought process based off the answer that I gave.
The mark of a very introspective individual.
We
Right.
try.
All right. Okay, we'll go on to our next question. So I'll be the same interviewer. Dr. Shi, radiation oncologist at UCLA, has not seen any application materials. Michaela, could you tell me a little bit about why medicine? Why not, something else?
Hi, Dr. Shi. It's very nice to meet you. Sorry, your internet cut out, but I believe you asked why medicine, correct? Okay, thanks. Just wanted to clarify that. There are many reasons I'm drawn to medicine. I worked as an EMT for 4 years throughout my undergraduate degree, and that's where I saw, the intersection between helping patients and getting to do that myself, but also seeing that of physicians when I brought them to the ER. Before that, I wasn't sure if medicine was for me. And through my community, the light was shed on patient contact and being able to find, my reasons for pursuing medicine further. Prior to that, I had wanted to do research, but I found that I didn't have the patient contact or the communication that I wanted to. After becoming an EMT, I found that there are a few reasons why I really wanted to pursue medicine. The first being that medicine necessitates teamwork to solve life-altering problems. Collaboration within research, also they have, the intersection within the community and keeping the community engaged to improve health outside of the hospital. And so I found that being an EMT, that wasn't enough. I would see patients on the front end, but I couldn't follow their journey past that. I also want to be a leader. I worked as a leader in it was called the Banquet, but it's a Meals on Wheels service for community members who are not lucky enough to have service to regular food. And so I was able to help organize and route food their way. Medicine naturally puts physicians as leaders. And so I've found that that's another reason I want to go into medicine. And lastly, probably the most exciting reason why I want to be a doctor is that medicine is a field of lifelong learning and lies at the intersection of art and science. And so I've enjoyed as an EMT, trying to understand people's stories better. And I think that that is an exceptional part of taking history and having those listening skills that are required to unlock kind of the scientific mystery at the core of a patient's narrative. Sorry, that jumble, but I was trying to remember some of the things I talked about.
Oh, that's so well done. I'm putting you all on the spot and you're doing it amazingly. So my thoughts, I think what I really, really liked about Michaela's response was the structure. I could follow it very clearly and I knew exactly where she was in sort of the journey and the story that she was taking me on. Especially the way that the EMT experience was sort of presented as like a door, but also sort of a corridor leading to maybe a slightly different path. So I think that for me, I really enjoyed sort of following her along that journey. Other thoughts from other panelists?
I think you were also incredibly eloquent. I loved your word choice and the way you were thinking through everything. I think that shows a lot of care, and I think that applies to not just this interview, but the practice at large. So you showed something deeper than just the response that you were giving.
I also want to call out how she clarified the question in the beginning. That's super okay to do and actually like very much encouraged, because you don't want to answer the wrong question. And she did it in a way that didn't seem like she wasn't listening. It was genuinely wanting to clarify. So like that's a great way to approach a situation like that.
Indeed, awesome, awesome stuff. And actually, just sort of one additional comment. So towards the end of Michaela's response, she mentioned that medicine was sort of a bridge between art and science. And to me, my ears perked up when I heard that, because that was if I was in an interview session, I would have used that as sort of the springboard to the next question to ask, what did you mean by that? So it's just sort of like, maybe in my head, I was planning to go on to the next question of like, give me your strengths and weaknesses. But if that piece was included in that response, then automatically I'm taken on this entirely different sort of story. So that just sort of goes to show that the content of your response can be as creative as you want it to be. And the more creative it is, oftentimes can elicit sort of like a very visceral reaction in your interviewer and make them want to sort of go down the path that you want them to. So maybe you can even sometimes direct the interview in certain directions if you play your cards right. But you know, that won't work on some people. They'll have very rigid ideas of what the interview is going to look like. All right, should we go on to our next question? Meeny, meeny, miny, mo. All right, Win, we'll do a different interviewer today. So my name is going to be Mr. Smith, and I am not a physician, but I'm one of the administrators here at UCLA, and I've been asked to look at your materials. I've seen your primary application, very accomplished, and all your secondaries. So I was hoping to get a little sense of, you've given me some very compelling information about why medicine, but I'm curious as to if medicine did not exist, what would you want to do instead?
Those are great questions. So thank you for asking that, Mr. Smith. So I think if medicine is not an option in my card, I was actually debating between two positions. I think I was wanting to either do a professorship or I want to run my own lab. And I think there's like two different reasons that I am still thinking about is because for professorship, I think what I really enjoyed is the ability to transfer knowledge to the next person. And I always believe that with more knowledge, we can always build a strong society, like even starting with young, go older. And to some extent, also apply to medicine, but because medicine is not in this practice, I just think about in terms of for students wise, if we can like empower everyone to do well, to expand what we know and to bring everything together to help society. I think that's a great thing as a professorship. And then for running a research lab, I have always been interested in scientific pursuits. I was biomedical engineering students at UCLA. I actually thought about applying MSTP for a really long time. And what I really like is that as a doctor, you have an impact on one patient, but as an innovator, you actually have an impact on hundreds to thousands of individuals. And the unfortunate thing is you will not get to see how they're going to be treated with the innovations, but the reality is that we're together, like as a community, like scientific community, we can bring everyone together and then work one step at a time to solve some of the hardest like unmet medical needs. So those are the two things that I really look forward to if medicine is not an option.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, that was awesome. I think what I really enjoyed about that was there were options. So it wasn't that the response was closed to, oh, let me think of the really like first thing that comes to mind and then I'll stick with that. Clearly the response was thought out. There were things that he sort of used as translatable skills that, these are things about medicine that I enjoy, but now that medicine is out of the picture, these are things that I can do in sort of the professorship arena or research or whatnot. So I think that those translatable skills is a very good backbone to have in a lot of responses, because if you get a question like that where it's asking about things not overtly related to medicine, you can very quickly tie it back to medicine using translatable skills. So I think that was really well done. Any other comments from panelists?
I like how you always mentioned, or many times you mentioned, if medicine is not the option, because to the interviewer, that shows that you're committed to that path. And that's really what you want to pursue. Because if you had said, oh, this or that, or, I'm interested in these other things, but didn't, re-emphasize your interest in medicine and make sure that they know that that is what you're pursuing, then they can ask you, well, why don't you go down that route instead? And then it can be harder to backtrack and say. So you did a fantastic job of framing your answers around the central idea that medicine is still your path.
I think with questions like these, so the first two questions that we asked were things that you should probably have, if not scripts, at least like notes for, but this is a question that might be harder to prepare. You don't know if you're going to be asked this. I think if you attended the workshop on secondaries last week, we were talking about how some prompts have like what the question actually is, and we like reworded some of those prompts to show the underlying question. I think a question like this also has an underlying question, which is not just like if medicine isn't an option, but rather what are your fundamental values? Like what do you like doing and what drives you? So if you can recognize those underlying questions, it might help you to formulate an answer that gets at the heart of the question. Even if you have trouble coming up with a profession, maybe you could have said something that's like, oh, I'm very service driven. That's why I would pick a career in service or something. That way, like you're still answering the question, even if you had difficulty coming up with an answer.
Indeed. Awesome job. All right. I guess we have one more. Last, but sorry. Oh, yes.
I just have a critique for my own response is that I didn't include as many examples as I would have liked. I feel like my internal clock was telling me that the answer was getting a little long, but if you can get an example, like let's say like since I was a TA or since I work in a lab for biomedical device, it doesn't take a whole lot. It may take like 1 or 2 more sentences, but I think it will add a lot more to that response that I just gave. But yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we'll stick with the Mr. Smith persona who has seen the application materials, but this time Mr. Smith has only seen the primary, not the secondary. So Amelia, it is so incredibly nice to meet you. I apologize we have to do this over Zoom. COVID has really wreaked havoc on everything. But sort of in that same vein, I was hoping to learn a little bit more about how COVID has affected you personally and sort of your pursuits.
It's really nice to meet you, Mr. Smith. Thanks for that question. This has been a tumultuous year for all of us. I actually was in my last year of undergraduate this past year. And so a lot of things have been affected by COVID, not the least of which was my academic year. But the part that affected me the most, or the part that I was most invested in, was how it affected my extracurriculars. I'm involved in my collegiate EMS organization. We're a volunteer organization that serves the campus community and provides free medical service. But given that we all went remote and back home in March of 2020, our service had to be canceled. So actually, as the chief of EMS, what I had to do was find ways for us to still be useful to the community during a time of equipment shortage and during a time of extreme uncertainty, to be able to still provide a service for the community during this time of special medical need. This was a large undertaking that I did from 3,000 miles away back home in California when my undergraduate institution was in Cleveland. And that required a lot of critical thinking, thinking on my feet, and being able to communicate effectively despite long distances. Eventually, we were able to get the service back up and running in August of 2020, which I considered to be a huge achievement.
Awesome. Well, that does sound like quite the momentous feat. All right, so I know we're sort of running a little low on time. We will have Q&A, and I think we'll extend beyond 8 o'clock for that. I want to be cognizant to give time for any questions that might come out. But I think Amelia did a phenomenal job here in addition to all the other panelists. And I think one thing that stood out to me especially was that the question inherently was sort of geared towards a little bit of a negative response. Like it was like, how has COVID affected you and sort of like your pursuits? So inherently it sort of pulls you in the direction of like, oh, what has been bad? Like how has shadowing experience been nixed? How has academics been affected, like not having like, the ability to go out and see friends and whatnot? So I think Amelia sort of did a very, very good approach in taking sort of identifying that, yes, there are these things that happened that were not like pleasant, But I was able to make good things happen out of those. And despite all of those challenges, I was still able to make things work and implement like real effects to the community. So I think that is something you always want to try to do when you're faced with questions that sort of orient you more towards a negative. I always try to flip it on its head and go more towards the positive. Any comments from other panelists? Oh, sorry, looks like I got cut out a little bit. So I think I'll just try to quickly summarize what I said. I apologize, my laptop is on its last legs. I think what I really liked about Amalia's response was her ability to sort of take a question that inherently guides towards the negative and flip it on its head to pursue some of the positive and show that, yes, there were things that went wrong. Yes, there were things that, I wish were different, but, in the face of all of that, I was still able to make impact, still get through it. And these were the things that I did to do that. So another very, very phenomenal response from Amelia. Any other comments from panelists here?
I like, Amelia, how you kept your EMS work central and then you kind of pulled other things from that. You talked about, where your undergrad was, how you had to work from 3,000 miles away, which inherently tells us that you're working virtually and you're having to deal with all of the virtual problems that there are in internet and things like that. You talked about, I like how you wrapped up with, where the EMS is at now and how you're able to get that back in person. You finished it on a high note, which is great. And I like that you didn't try to cover too much because there are many, like Ryan was saying, negative aspects of COVID, but you were kind of able to talk about one central idea and then pull a few other details into that.
All right, so I'll give a hand for our panelists. Excellent responses. And, I didn't give them any time to prep this. I didn't tell them questions ahead of time at all. I just said, this could happen. So I think that the sort of eloquence that you witnessed today is just sort of speaks to, being able to practice and get these types of responses down. And there is an impromptu element too that I think everyone demonstrated very well. So phenomenal job, panelists. I think at this time we'll open it up for questions. I do want to be respectful of time. So if you do need to head out, feel free to do so. We do have, I think, a feedback form and other sort of links on our agenda if you want to check them out. But I'll just sort of stop the recording here and we can go into the Q&A.